our last two panels of the day are two subjects I'm really, really excited about because they're supported by the McKnight Foundation, and they've been a great supporter of Food Tank's work. And our first one, panel 4, is on true cost accounting. And we have worked very hard over the last several months to really amplify a lot of the work being done by other organizations on this subject. And you know, counting the external costs of food production is not an easy thing to do, but there are some great groups around the United States and around the world who are, again, doing this job very well. And I'm truly honored that Patrick Holden of the Sustainable Food Trust, which is based in the United Kingdom, has come to DC to keynote this panel. The Sustainable Food Trust has been a leader on this issue, and Patrick is using his expertise as a farmer, researcher, and advocate to push for true cost accounting, to really push true cost accounting in agriculture into the mainstream. We are also excited to have Jason Huffman of Politico as our moderator for this panel. Jason is the agriculture and trade editor for Politico and has a long history of reporting on health issues, and I'm really glad he could also be with us today. I really just am excited for this panel, and I want to welcome our keynote, our panelists, and our moderator out to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. I didn't hear the introduction, but my name is Patrick Holden, and I'm very happy indeed to be with you this afternoon and for this invitation to come to the Food Tank Summit. I just wanted to make one observation. I've been coming to food conferences for many, many years, and I don't think I've ever been to a conference with so many young people and with such a clear majority of the delegates women, which is a fantastic thing, and obviously a sign that something is afoot, which is really wonderful. I have been over the Christmas, I'm a dairy farmer, and have been on a farm in West Wales of I'm farming about 300 acres with a herd of 80 dairy cows, produce Ayrshire's, they are a native breed, producing milk for cheese making. And we're in our 41st year on the farm, and during that time we've used no nitrogen fertilizer and no pesticides, and we've tried to farm as sustainably as possible. And over the Christmas break period, my herdsman went away, so I've been really in the thick of it, getting up very early in the morning, milking the cows, scraping up, bedding down, feeding the calves, and doing all the other jobs. Because we've got lots of young stock as well, so it's about 150 head of cattle, and then repeating the whole thing in the afternoon. And it makes you very mindful of the work that goes into producing milk. And then I got relieved by my herdsman coming back after the break, and I went back to Bristol, where the offices of the Sustainable Food Trust are, and I went into Tesco's. And this is the beginning of my talk about true cost accounting in the food system. And I went to the milk aisle, and there's various milks there, you know, full fat and half fat and all the rest of it. But there's a big thing going on in the UK at the moment. 4 pints of milk, which is 2.2 litres or thereabouts, there's a price war going on. And all the big supermarkets are competing downwards. It's a race to the bottom. And the current price to beat, which Aldi and Lidl, you may not have heard of those two supermarkets, they're the ones that are gaining the market share from Tesco's and Morrison's and the middle market people. They're all charging 89 pence for 4 pints, not your pints, our pints, because they're all different, aren't they? Which is a bit of a muddle about this, of milk. So I'm sorry about switching between pints and litres, because we're all muddled up as well. But essentially, the price per litre of milk is 40 pence for that milk. For the organic milk, which I haven't got time to talk about in detail, it's a pound a litre. That's the retail price, a pound a litre for organic milk. Normal, conventional milk 40 pence a litre. And that really shocked me. So I started to think about that, because that means I know what price conventional dairy farmers are getting for their milk at the moment, because of course I study these things. I get the Dairy Farmer magazines and all that kind of thing. They are getting a price which is way below the cost of production, about 22 to 25 pence. We're getting 40 pence for our milk. And even that price, which sounds so much more, is actually just on the cost of production, arguably, depending on how borrowed you are, slightly less than the cost of production. And this begs the question, what's going on, and what is the true cost of milk? How could it possibly be that we could be selling milk from industrial production at 40 pence a litre, 22 pence to the farmer, when those same systems of farming are costing so much to the environment and public health? And how could it also be that the most unsustainable milk is the cheapest and the most sustainable milk is the most expensive? Now, I got really exercised by this, as you do if you're a dairy farmer and you see this. So I wrote a blog about it on our SFT newsletter, which you can have a look at, because you can subscribe to it. You just go to our Sustainable Food Trust website, and you'll see you can just log on to our newsletter. And it's had a lot of reaction, because at the end of this blog I suggested that actually we needed to have a fair trade label for organic milk, because until now fair trade's been associated with tea, coffee and bananas in developing countries, and not feather-bedded European, in my case, farmers who are benefiting of the common agricultural policy and all the rest of it, which is completely nonsense, because we really are facing a situation where the small family dairy farm is being sort of culturally cleansed by price. But it's not dramatic, so it doesn't make the news, because they just quietly give up. And because the bank manager says, I'm sorry, we're going to pull the plug on you because you're just too borrowed, because there's so long you can go on selling milk at below the cost of production. So this seems to me the most extraordinary thing, that all these things are going on, that the price of milk is so low that we don't know the hidden costs, we don't know the true cost. And we need to know that. And that's really what I wanted to talk to you about. The Sustainable Food Trust has decided that we are going to make true cost accounting, the investigation of this issue, a focus of our work over the coming period. And we've already put quite a lot of time into it. The Prince of Wales gave a speech in Georgetown University in 2011 called The Future of Food, in which he mentioned this. You know, why is it that the polluter isn't paying, and how much are all those costs? The Sustainable Food Trust then took this on and had a conference in Kentucky in April 2013, where we brought together 60 or so experts, and we had a discussion about this. And then we took it to London in December 2013, where we had 500 or 600 people over 3 days looking at this issue. And what we wanted to do was to change the situation where, if you are a farmer or a foods business today and you're looking at the business case, the way to make money, the most profitable thing to do is to farm as intensively as possible. That's the way you might make a margin if you're any good at it. And the least profitable to do if you're a farmer or a food business is to sell sustainably produced food. There are exceptions, obviously entrepreneurs and all the rest of it, but the odds are stacked against you, because the polluter's not paying and the beneficial outcomes of sustainable food systems are not being rewarded financially to those who are involved with them. And conversely, if you're a citizen and a consumer, you'll pay most for the food with a good story, which is benefiting the planet and public health, and least for the food which is doing damage to public health and the environment. So we need to identify why that is the case, and that's really the task, to identify and categorize the various costs and benefits arising from different food systems. And some of those issues, costs and benefits, are to do with emissions, gases going into the atmosphere, nitrous oxide, ammonia, that sort of thing, pollution of water, general pollution, of depletion or building of natural capital, that could be soil, or it could be depletion of minerals. Are there proper prices put on that? So if a farmer builds soil fertility, is he or she rewarded for that? Or if you deplete soil fertility, that's like depleting the balance sheet, so that ought to be properly costed. Biodiversity, that's come up a lot at this event. Impact on human health, that's probably the mother of all externalities, as economists call them. So this is a whole range of different issues, from antibiotics resistance to endocrine disruptors. I'm sure that'll come up in this discussion, and their effect on maybe cancers and other ill health effects, obesity, diabetes, infectious diseases. No one is properly doing work to connect up the methods of food production that have been dominant over 40 or 50 years and the negative health outcomes, or indeed the positive health outcomes. And then finally, there's more difficult to quantify stuff, cultural, spiritual health, ethical issues like animal welfare. These are more difficult to quantify, but they need to be. So we need to identify them, and then we need to categorize them, and we need to quantify them. We need to work out how much damage is being caused, so that we can then put a price on the damage caused and then work out what to do about it. And an example of this would be nitrogen fertilizer, where there has been some work done. The European Union, some scientists in the European Union have done work, and they've worked out, and I'm putting this in US figures, that 1 ton of ammonium nitrate costs a US farmer about $387. Anybody who knows about this better than I do can correct me. The benefit to the farmer, because obviously it's a business case for buying it, that's why they're using it, is between $666 and $2,666 per US ton. But the negative cost, the damage to the environment, pollution, human health, depletion of natural capital, etc., are between $990 and $5,172 per US ton of ammonium nitrate. So in other words, if the damage done was charged to the farmer or the nitrogen fertilizer manufacturer, it would completely cancel out the business case for using it. And it would transform agriculture all over the world, but that's not happening. So we need to put a price on all the externalities, positive and negative, and then that will give us the information to use various policy and economic instruments to tax the polluter, regulate by banning the worst practices, that just came up in the last session with food waste, legislate in other ways to restrict the capacity of people to do damage to the environment and human health, redirect the subsidies of the Farm Bill. Yes, I've run out of time. I'll be very quick. Price natural capital. Maybe you could pay farmers to be carbon stewards. If we could measure soil carbon outcomes of different farming systems, we can reward the ones that increase carbon and penalize the ones that don't. We can use market and certification. We've been using markets all along. That's what the organic food market is about, but it's not enough on its own. We need to combine it with these other policy instruments. And we need to have risk-related insurance stuff and other things like that, where we can recognize that some farming practices are damaging and maybe have, insurance stuff, which will start to correct it. And if we do all that and we work together on that, we will arrive, hopefully, at a situation where we can achieve a situation where there is a good business case for sustainable food production and a much less good business case for intensive and industrial food production. Now, to do that is going to take an enormous international collaborative effort. Work has already started on this. There's a man called Pavan Sukhdev, an Indian man who's the instigator of a project called TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, who's already done a lot of work on that and pricing natural capital. But he came to our London event. He said, we need to have like a Stern-type review of farming and food systems externalities, and it needs to involve multiple institutions from all over the world. That project has started. It's got about 6 million euros from various sources. The European Commission, the Norwegian government, and also the Moore Foundation in the US has contributed to it so far, and hopefully others will come in. And Food Tank are going to be doing some work on this, which is fantastic news. This needs to be an international collaboration between multiple institutions and individuals all over the world, because we need to do this, because until we do it, the greatest single barrier to mainstreaming sustainable food systems will remain in place. So let's collaborate in this new spirit. Thank you.
I was also introduced, but again, I'm Jason Huffman. I am the editor of Politico Pro's agriculture and trade verticals. I get the pleasure of working with a group of a group of 9 of us that are really talented. Our reporters are outstanding. Jenny Hopkinson, I think I saw her here a minute ago. Jenny, if you're here, put your hand up. Thanks, Jenny. She's embarrassed. Anyhow, I just want to say how incredible it is that Food Tank, after such a short period of time, has pulled together an event like this. This is very slick, and I think they should get a round of applause right now. And I was very honored that they asked me to moderate this panel. I was thinking about, what do I want to get out of this panel? And I thought, I'm I know, we've been watching a lot of the Best Picture nominees recently for the Oscars. And whenever I walk out of one of those movies, how do I feel? I want everyone to feel that way. You know, yes, some of the movies there's one movie that's a comedy. I'm not looking for that. But you know, you're a little disturbed. You also come out with a little sense of hope. And you might wonder, how did that guy get that part? And I'm not aiming for that. But yeah, we have an outstanding panel. I'm going to go left to right through the panel very quickly, and then we're going to get rolling into the Q&A. First on my left here is Peter Myers. He's with the Environmental Health Sciences. He is an expert on endocrine disruption, and we're going to probably talk about that right away out of the gate. Next is Jenn Yates, Union of Concerned Scientists. David Aylward with Ashoka. Tom McDougall with 4P Foods. Paul Shapiro with the Humane Society of the United States. And John Buchanan with the Conservation International. Peter, I'm going to kick things off with you. We've got some news recently from Europe that we were talking about back in the green room. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what that news is and what it means. And then I want to ask you this question. Endocrine disruption, what is the single issue today that worries you the most about that topic?
Okay. Let me answer in the context of Patrick's comments and the purpose of this panel, health externalities. And I want to remind you, remember what Nora said yesterday? She said when her customers ask her why they should pay more for organic food, and she said, well, would you rather pay me a little more and your doctor a lot more later? That's those are about health externalities, okay? The best estimate right now, done about 5 years ago, of health externalities of the use of pesticides in the US is about $10 billion. It was done by David Pimentel from Cornell University. So that's a big number, $10 billion related to the use of pesticides. But when I respond to your question about what's really got me worried, actually that number is likely to be much, much bigger than $10 billion if we get the science right. What happened in Europe yesterday was the European Food Safety Authority, which is related, it's kind of like their Food and Drug Administration. They issued a new standard for bisphenol A, BPA. You all heard of BPA? Well, there's a big fight here, a big fight in Europe about how much is safe. And Europe lowered the standard yesterday, the EFSA, by a factor of 10 from what it had been. But they concluded that at current levels of exposure, it's probably not a problem from food exposure. But they did say there's some experiments underway. We're going to be revisiting this as more information comes out. With respect to what worries me most, if you know anything about how the EPA and the FDA use science to reach regulatory decisions, you know that the tools they use are decades out of date. They do not reflect what's happened in science, in molecular biology, in genetics, in reproductive biology, over the last 20 years, actually a lot longer than that. And so the safety standards upon which every one of us is depending upon today are so far out of date that we can't count on them. And unfortunately, those agencies are kind of stuck. They are unwilling to take advantage of that new science. And I actually a lot of my work is one key piece of that, which is the way that regulatory testing is done to establish at what level is this chemical safe is in the labs, typically industry labs, and the data never are made available to the public. They start at high doses, and they work down to get to low doses where they don't see an effect. Then they say, well, people are different, so let's divide that level by 10. And because kids aren't little adults, let's divide it by another 10. So ultimately, they introduce a safety factor of 1,000-fold between where they didn't see an effect and what they declare as safe. But they never test what is safe. Why is that important? Well, I work on chemicals that behave like hormones, endocrine disruptors. And it turns out that hormones, you ask any endocrinologist, how hormones work, what happens at high doses can be completely different from what happens at low doses, and you can't predict what's happening at low doses from high dose experiments. what we think is going to happen, and we're in a fight right now with the EPA, the National Academy of Sciences just agreed with us, we think that probably dozens, if not more, chemical safety factors are going to have to be strengthened by a factor of at least 1,000, which is going to take a bunch of chemicals off the market, pesticides and other industrial chemicals. That's going to make us healthier. That's going to reduce those health externalities that currently include a range of today's epidemics: diabetes, prostate cancer, breast cancer, ADHD, autism. So the science on all of those disease endpoints is not certain. There are always questions scientists can raise. But for each of them, there are serious links to endocrine disrupting compounds, so serious that the World Health Organization 2 years ago declared endocrine disruption a global public health threat. You can find that on their website. Thank you.
Jenn, I'm going to go to you, and feel free to chime in. Any of the members of the panel can chime in at any time on any of these issues. Just jump right in. We talked a little bit on the phone before this, and I asked you basically what kind of issues are you most concerned about, and you talked a little bit about how the government supports the food system and what particular types of foods they support. Talk a little bit about that, but also what do you see that could potentially change this?
Okay, thanks, Jason. So at the Union of Concerned Scientists, we tend to look at some of the problems we see in our food system, such as environmental and public health issues. And we also look at how the policies that we have in our country are lending to those challenges. And so in particular, we've been looking at the agricultural practices and the agriculture system writ large. So it's not an accident that we grow so much corn and soybeans in our country and other types of commodity crops. It's not an accident that we have only 2% of our farmland devoted to fruit and vegetable production. We feel very strongly that there's an almost bipolar approach to agriculture and food and dietary guidance in this country. We have one arm of the federal government telling us that half of our plates should be fruits and vegetables, and then what we actually subsidize, and by subsidize I don't mean just the sort of the direct payments that are often vilified, but insurance and research and many other kinds of supports for the agriculture sector. Those two things are quite at odds with each other. So we're saying do this to be more nutritious, and then on the other hand, we're supporting the complete opposite. Most of the corn and soybeans and other commodity crops are, when they are actually going to food, are largely for, livestock feed and for processed food. So that's not the type of food that we're being told we should be eating. At the same time, the practices that are being employed by the majority of farms on this country are leading to a lot of environmental problems. We've got everything from soil erosion, runoff into the Gulf of Mexico and dead zones and the problems associated there. We've got climate change, everyone has been speaking to that issue. There's the public health impacts of our current system, such as antibiotic resistance. And there's also the impacts of the diet-related diseases that are part of the supports that we give to these ingredients for these processed foods. So we're spending billions of dollars subsidizing the current system, and then we're spending billions of dollars to deal with the public health and environmental impacts on the other end. So we think there's a better way. So the other half of our work is analyzing what are the alternatives, and that's where there's really reason for hope. There are fantastic researchers at places like Iowa State and Cornell and all the other land-grant universities around the country who are doing research into sustainable farming methods and ways that we could be doing things that vastly reduce some of these externalities without compromising productivity or profitability for farmers. So, researchers have been finding that you can maintain productivity and profitability by just adding in 1 more or 2 more crops into the rotation with corn and soybeans in the Midwest. And you can vastly reduce your pesticide uses and fertilizer applications at the same time.
If you make the changes cost neutral, there's some chance of initiative there. But you're not giving anybody anything to reach for at that point. Do you also need to change consumer behavior?
Well, you know.
And how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's, I think Richard on the last panel said, you know, this tyranny of cheap food. And I do think that that's a caution, that we don't want to say all food should be cheaper and incentivize consumer behavior in that way. I think that, you know, we need to figure out what is a real price for our food, what is a fair price for our food, and then address the issues associated with how there are so many in our country who cannot make the choice to purchase healthy food. And we absolutely focus on food disparities and food access issues as well. So we do need to give farmers who are internalizing their costs, who are doing things like planting cover crops and doing crop rotations, who are planting buffer strips, who are doing things that can really make a difference when it comes to many of the problems that we've all been talking about. Those farmers deserve to be paid the right price for their food, as Patrick was saying before too about the price of dairy. So I think that, you know, that is the next step in the question is, how do you set a fair price? How do you set a price that recognizes the internalized costs? And then how do you make that food affordable for everyone?
David, you have some experience in other parts of the world. Might you weigh in on this?
Yeah, we have the pleasure of working with Ashoka picks and supports the best social entrepreneurs in the world. So we have 3,000 Ashoka fellows around the world doing really exciting stuff in this field. And actually, just before we start, I want to pay tribute to some, we all stand on shoulders of people before us. And the last time I was in this room was 9 years ago when we were having a tribute to George McGovern on his 85th birthday. If there's anybody who kind of saw food and nutrition as an issue in the 1950s, for God's sake, and lived it his whole life, it was that man, and he was a great mentor of mine. And plus my grandfather was a dairy farmer. So, but in trying to create demand, intelligent demand, there are a lot of you who are focused on the supply side of this. God bless you, you should be. But unless we get consumers saying no, yeah, it's cheap, but there are a lot of things that are cheap that I don't buy. I don't buy the cheapest beer. I don't buy the cheapest food. I don't buy the cheapest clothes because they don't last long. So I think what's starting to happen is we're starting to see social entrepreneurs and others start succeeding by getting people to understand the cost to themselves and the benefits to themselves. This business of externalizing costs onto the society is an old one. We've been down this road many times, whether it was the chemical industry, cheap energy, remember, it's called coal. Unless you start, if you live in Beijing, you see immediately what's going on with the externalization of costs. So we're focused on doing demand. The problem with demand is if you want to buy nourishing food, and by the way, I love organic, but organic does not necessarily mean nourishing. So if I want, it means I don't have the bad things on it that you're talking about. If I go into my store, which I do once a week, it's really hard to know what to buy. So that stuff on the box, with all due respect to the stuff on the box, doesn't tell me that that food is bioavailable. It doesn't tell me that the vitamins and minerals are bioavailable to me. It doesn't tell me the outcomes. It doesn't tell me whether, I don't know whether the tomatoes here were picked red or green. And so giving consumers the tools to know what is nourishing and how they're doing on outcomes, so we get away from the tyranny of the scales. BMI is not a measurement of nourishment. It tells me whether I'm fat or not. I already know that. I don't need to do the calculation. So I know, all right, but it's a good beer. So, so empowering people with tools to measure nourishment and showing them what happens when it does. Because the costs individually, it's not just illness. Illness is bad, and whether it's mental illness, physical illness. There's a whole, we can talk for a long time, and I'm happy to, that's what I do for a living, about the costs of people who are not nourished properly. But look at it positively. If our goal is vitality, energy, enjoy life, do the best you can, have a 4-year-old really able to learn, it's not a question of whether they're sick, it's a question of whether they've been given the right fuel. And that's an individual thing. So I think there are opportunities here. We're having a conversation today we were not having 5 years ago. So I'm actually very optimistic that we can turn this around, particularly from the demand side. On the supply side, it's going to be a bitch because those people are making lots of money, they're well armed, and they have high castle walls and hot oil. But on the demand side, I think the serfs may be able to win.
Tom, talk a little bit about your business, and it's really fascinating and what you're doing. And you're just getting started, so we were talking about the hours that you've been working.
It's terrifying. Yeah, it's, we're still very much a startup, so it's terrifying and awesome and terrible and wonderful all at the same time. I'm glad you brought up the point of really trying to drive demand as part of the solution, because I think that's what we're trying to do. As a brief backstory, our business, 4P Foods, was largely an inspiration that I had from experience with a CSA. Most people know it's a community-supported agriculture. It's a way to participate in your local food economy, where you find a farm and you buy a share in that farm, and then every week during the season you get a box of food. And it's great, and it's romantic in theory because like my farmers, Steve and Anita, wonderful people. They had 2 girls and white picket fence, the whole 9. I knew exactly how their food was grown with organic practices. And I was trying to evangelize to all of my friends that they should sign up for this thing, and realized I sort of began to hear myself explaining how it worked. I'm like, well, yeah, you pay in the beginning of the season for 6 months of vegetables. If you're out of town, yeah, that's challenging, but don't worry about it. And then you go to a random front porch across town to pick up this box of vegetables. Yes, it's a random front porch across town, and I don't have a car, so I got on my bike, and ironically, it rains almost every Tuesday, apparently. So it's uphill both ways in the rain to get a random box. There were several times where people stopped me. I'm like, what are you doing, sir? Because I would run up and get a box and put it on my bike, and off I go. So of course my friends wouldn't sign up because they thought I was nuts, and in many ways I think I was. And then around about the same time, I was reading one too many Michael Pollan books, and that really started the beginning of my quarter-life crisis. Because I realized that this is such a big problem.
Michael Pollan is the road to ruin.
Yeah, I don't know if I should thank him or blame him, but it kind of opened my eyes of just how big this problem is. Mark Bittman recently said, if we're going to change food, we need to change everything. So because I was looking at money in politics and our education system and food itself and all of these externalized costs, and all that I really kind of knew was small business. And that's when I sort of landed on some of these ideas around true cost of counting is maybe could we use this engine of business to do something about it? So I started 4P Foods. We're a benefit corporation, which we could talk about more later. We're a benefit corporation which gets local food from about 100 small local farms here in the DC region. And we deliver it to our customers every week. We deliver it to them at their house or at their office so they don't have to take that fatal bike ride. We let them skip anytime they want, so if they're traveling, that's fine. And they also don't get corn hangover, which I had every August because we just got lots of corn all August. And I love corn, but you can only do so much with corn. So by having 100 farms, we have a lot of diversity. So in theory, we're making local food, local sustainable organic food, as easy, if not easier, than going to the grocery store. But it's not cheap. So we target a certain demographic of people that can afford that. But as a benefit corporation, we then are able to take a percentage of all the food that we bring to our customers, to our members, and we set it aside and we donate it to our partner Martha's Table here in the city, and they work with low-income communities. So if our members who can afford this $35 bag of sexy kale and beautiful raspberries and shiitake mushrooms, the kids in their after-school program are eating kale and raspberries and shiitake mushrooms and learn about where it came from and why is it good, and this is extremely nutrient-dense. And our members of our community that we're building, the people that can afford it, they're happy because not only is it the health for them, but they know that a percentage of all of their food dollars, they're voting with their fork quite effectively, are going to support their low-income neighbors. So in theory, and thankfully, it's actually working. We're growing every month. We're adding more members than we're losing. We're adding more farm partners. We're now about to do meats and eggs and hopefully seafood. So it is creating demand, but it's also creating a community of people who really care about their role in the greater picture.
Let me ask you a quick question.
Sure.
And I know your answer because you wouldn't be doing it otherwise, but the interest in local food, is this a trend or is this something that might stick around for a long time?
I mortgaged my house and dumped my life savings into a local food, vegetable company. So if it is indeed a trend, I've got a problem. But no, it can't be a trend, because if it is a trend, if it comes and goes, then all of these problems that we've been talking about for the last day and a half are only going to get worse. It is one of the pieces of the solutions. I heard someone very eloquently say that if we're going to redesign a new, equitable, just food system of tomorrow, it will look a lot like a hologram, where there's all these little solutions, all these individual pictures of everyone playing their part, but taken together as a whole, then it's this sort of beautiful thing that may work. So I don't think it's a trend. I think it's part of that bigger solution.
Let me ask you one more question.
Sure.
Local food doesn't necessarily mean organic.
No.
What standards do you maintain for your suppliers?
Great question, and we get it almost all the time. Is your food organic? It's really hard, particularly here in the Mid-Atlantic, because of the scale of the farms that are here, because of the lack of infrastructure, because a lot of it is really high humidity. There's very few organic farms in the area. Certified organic. There are a lot that use organic practices, and we source from those folks. But we don't say that it's certified organic. However, we're out there visiting with the farms, making sure that they use integrated pest management, making sure they're using no sprays ideally, low sprays if they have to, and are they moving in that right direction? And that's really sort of the big thing for us is, are they trying to be good stewards of the land? Can we help them move in that direction?
If I could just add a measurement point. Right now on the surface of Mars, there's a little thing moving around called the rover. And on it is a 7.2 kilogram mini mass spectrometer that is measuring the organic content of everything that the machine picks up and reporting back, this is what's in the rock. It's not saying how many grams of salt are in the rock and how many grams of vitamin A are in the rock. It's saying what is in the rock. It's this big. NASA is very interested in taking that machine and using it for nutrition. So we're talking to them now about replicating what is now done with a machine this big and a machine this big, and by the time I lose all my hair, it'll be done in a machine this big, and somebody will be able to stand, or he'll buy one of them in his store and say, look, we're just running the produce through here. So this tomato was picked red and grown out of highly nourished soil, and it's really high in nourishment, not 2 or 3, all of them. And this one wasn't. And you can take it with some dead cells on your hand and see how you're doing. That technology is within the next 5-6 years. So we're going to have a power in our hands to fight back in these things and to do more than getting on the scale in the morning.
Paul, we hear from your organization every week, so I'm going to skip you this time. No.
We have a great communications department, Jason.
You know, I wanted to ask you about this because I was curious. The Humane Society has been very successful in recent times at bending corporate policies, getting corporations to come along and change what they do. To what do you attribute that success?
That's very kind of you, Jason. Thanks. I'm glad to go after the dead skin cells and the sexy kale. It's,
How about it?
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much. It's great to be back at GW, my alma mater. I was actually showing my co-panelists right beforehand that I still carry my 1998 student ID that does have my photo on it. And if you're wondering why, the only reason is for student discounts at movie theaters, and it does still work amazingly. I had more hair here and less hair here back then. I don't know how that happened.
It's called gravity.
Yeah.
I know.
Anyway, so Jason, I appreciate the question, and you're right. I mean, you look at the success in changing the way that animals are treated in our food system. Some of it has been from us enacting public policies. Most famously, California just a few weeks ago implemented the law that we passed there, Proposition 2, which we passed 6 years ago, but which relates to the treatment of egg-laying hens and breeding pigs and veal calves. But most of the success has been through the implementation not of public policies, but rather of corporate policies. And so the Humane Society of the US works with all hosts of companies from Costco to Safeway to Burger King and McDonald's and more to help them implement policies that say if you're going to supply us with food, then here are the animal care standards you must adhere to. It's not a strategy of urging individual consumers, for example, to forego gestation crate pork when they go to the supermarket or to seek out a label. Those strategies certainly have their place, but some things that we do to animals, just like Patty was saying on two or three panels ago, there are some things that we do in the food system which are really so heinous we just shouldn't allow them. And locking animals in cages and crates where they can barely move an inch their entire lives qualifies. It shouldn't be that you look for a label to avoid it. It should be that it simply ought not be permitted. I mean, for Lord's sake, we have in our country 50 states that ban cockfighting. We think it's so cruel that we take 2 chickens and put them in a ring together to fight for a couple minutes that we make it a criminal offense in all 50 states. But if you want to take 8 chickens and put them in a cage together for a year and a half where each bird has less space than this sheet of paper on which to live, I mean, this is the amount of space that each one of these laying hens has in cages. That's 9 out of 10 of the egg cartons sold in our country. The bird has that much space on which to live for more than a year before she's slaughtered. And it's hard to imagine a more miserable existence. So when we work with these companies, we help them implement these policies that prohibit those types of practices in their supply chains. And we don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We're not asking them to implement an idyllic food system. What we're asking them to do is to improve their supply chain, to, for example, say no more cages for laying hens, no more gestation crates for pigs, and so on. And because these companies, sometimes they really have people in them who want to do the right thing. Other times we're working with their major investors. For example, right now, next week I'll be in Austin, Minnesota speaking at the Hormel shareholder meeting about their use of gestation crates. And a number of their biggest investors have pledged in the last week to vote with the Humane Society shareholder proposal to have the company disclose what type of reputational risk the company assumes by continuing to allow the use of gestation crates in the Hormel supply chain. So whether it's from wanting to do the right thing, wanting to avoid being associated with animal cruelty, or wanting to have a sustainability halo, a lot of these companies will implement these policies that really are changing the way that we are interacting with the animals in our food supply chain. One final note, the first time I ever went to a factory farm, I was a student here at GW. And I have been reading about this facility in Maryland. It's about 2 hours away. It's a local factory farm. All factory farms are local somewhere, of course. And I was reading about this place. I knew they had 800,000 birds at this egg factory. And I thought, well, I want to go out and just check it out, see if all this literature and videos and stuff that I thought was it propaganda. I wanted to go see it for myself. So with a couple friends, I drove out to Maryland. And we walked up, we saw this humongous facility. I mean, if it wasn't for the stench of feces in the air, you wouldn't have known that animals, let alone nearly 1 million of them, were calling this facility home. And we walked up, I remember I was very nervous. I reached out my hand and I turned the door handle clockwise and pulled this door toward us. And it felt like there was like this local darkness that was engulfing the space right in front of us. We walked into the darkness, closed the door behind us. It was so pitch black, we couldn't even see our hand in front of our face. And so I turned on a flashlight, and we saw just manure as far as the eye could see. We realized we were in the manure pit of this factory farm. So I looked up, and there they were, just hundreds of thousands of yellow feet clutching gray metal wire. It was a sea of white feathers. These birds were locked in these cages so cramped they couldn't even spread their wings. We walked upstairs and walked amongst these birds. We saw dead birds in cages with live birds. We saw birds entangled in the wires of their cages. All of these birds laying eggs for human consumption, and this was a normal egg factory. And by today's standards, it would still be a normal egg factory today, producing nearly all of the eggs that we consume in our country. And as I was walking through there and looking at these animals all around me and what would be criminal if the victims were dogs or cats, but because the victims are chickens, or in other cases pigs and other farm animals, that, you know, we can commit this type of cruelty with impunity to them. And I wondered to myself, why would we treat these animals like this? What crime could they have committed to deserve that fate? I mean, we don't treat the worst criminals in our society the way that we treat our farm animals. Murderers, rapists, we don't put them in cells so small that they can't even lift their arms up, or they can't even turn around, where they just have to stand like this for the entirety of their sentence and never move, never turn around, never extend their limbs. Yet that is the standard practice in the egg industry. It's the standard practice for breeding pigs. It's common practice. The abuses that we're talking about, they're not anomalies. This is the norm in these industries for hundreds of millions of animals. And so when we talk about the true accounting, we have to say, yes, overcrowding animals might cheapen the cost of that product, but they're hidden costs. In this case, the hidden cost of increased animal cruelty and increased food safety risk, because such overcrowding increases the risk of salmonella in these factories, as documented by numerous studies, including the Pew Commission on Industrial Farm Animal Production, whose executive director, Bob Martin, we have in the audience today. But the fact is that the hidden cost of so much of our animal product production in our country is increased animal cruelty, food safety risk, public health problems, and so on. It doesn't get paid at the counter, at the price when you go up and pay at a restaurant or at a grocery chain, but it's being paid elsewhere, both by animals and by us. And it's time for us to start highlighting and shining a very bright light on this otherwise dark and hidden world of factory farming that produces nearly all of the animal products in our country.
Paul, I wanted to. There have been a number of very high-profile events in animal welfare in recent times. Your group's success with gestation crates for sows, but also in California where they passed a law for egg-laying hens. And I'm curious about that particular situation because that law just went into effect. What are you seeing on the ground, or are you monitoring what's happening on the ground? And will it affect laws in other states? Will it affect the practices of the egg business? What's happening?
Great questions. A lot is happening in California. In 2008, California became the first state in our country to ban battery cage confinement of egg-laying hens. And other states have passed similar laws in its wake since then, like Michigan passed a similar law, Ohio placed a moratorium on new battery cage construction, and so on. But the law that we passed in 2008 took effect this January 1st. So the egg producers had 6 years to come into compliance, but instead of using that time to come into compliance with the law and depreciating their equipment, many of them, unfortunately, sat on their hands, or even worse, sued and sued and sued, and they lost and they lost and they lost. They sued 4 times to try to either nullify the law, delay the law, get injunctions, and so on. And they've lost every single lawsuit. 2 of them are still on appeal. But the real key component of the impact in California is not just Proposition 2, which says that that hens in California can't be locked up in battery cages. But 2 years later, the California legislature passed a law called AB 1437, which requires that all of the shell eggs sold in California must be produced in compliance with Prop 2. So in other words, if you're producing eggs in Iowa or Missouri and you want to sell eggs into the California marketplace, you have to comply with their rules. The same way California has rules for auto efficiency if you want to sell cars into the state, or they have a somatic cell count for milk. You can't sell milk with a higher somatic cell count into California than what their producers can do. And so that's what's really changing the national egg industry now, because California is a huge egg consumer. And that we're seeing is changing a lot of the egg industry toward cage-free, which is a substantial improvement over battery cages. It's not idyllic. It's not like these animals are living on old McDonald's farm, but it is changing the way that laying hens are treated across the country. Egg prices, there's been a lot in the news about the egg prices in California. Yes, they have gone up. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the egg producers simply aren't prepared, that supply and demand just haven't come into equilibrium as a result of this new law taking effect. At the same time, beef prices have gone up way more than egg prices have gone up right now, and Prop 2 had nothing to do with beef. Egg prices always rise in the winter. And similarly, in the European Union, in 2012, they implemented a similar law across all of the member states in the EU. And the same thing happened. Egg prices went up for the first year as supply and demand were out of whack. And then after about a year, things evened out. And I think that's what we'll see. Egg prices certainly will be slightly higher because the reason why the birds are kept in battery cages is to artificially cheapen the cost of those eggs at the supermarket. But it's not dramatic. In fact, egg prices fluctuate far more dramatically throughout the year and over the years than what we'll see as a result of a conversion to cage-free systems.
Thank you. John, I saved you for last.
Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about this is a good segue because you deal with suppliers. Could you talk a little bit about what your organization does and a little bit about the challenge for suppliers in these types of situations where new standards are being raised and how you get them to come along?
Absolutely, great. Thank you, Jason. Thanks to you all for being here and to Food Tank and GW for organizing this. Conservation International is coming, well, our mission is to conserve nature for the benefit of people around the world. Most of our work is in tropical countries. That's because that's where the highest biodiversity is around the world. That's also where most of the world's poor lives. In developing countries, most of those, the poor in developing countries are in rural areas. And we all depend upon nature for clean air, clean water, food, all that good stuff that you guys know. But it's the world's poor that most directly depend upon those resources. And so a lot of our work when it comes down to agriculture is very simply recognizing that agriculture is the basis for so many rural livelihoods. It has the potential to lift so many people out of poverty. But how do we help people implement farming practices that can increase productivity, improve profitability, diversify diets, help them live better lives without destroying the environment, without expanding, cutting down critical forests, without poisoning or polluting rivers. And so, at its simplest, and that's complex, but at its simplest, it's how do you help improve production here and conserve critical forests? That's what we do. My team in particular works with the private sector, and we target some of the big industries and the big actors in those industries to try and take advantage of the buying power that they have, the Walmarts, the Nestle's, the Unilevers of the world, to try and send that demand signal down through supply chains to try and reward and incentivize farmers to implement better practices, and to be sending signals to governments as well that markets care about sustainability, that we need to change the food system. And that's one of the common.
So you start with the buyer.
My team starts with the buyer.
Right.
And we try and work with them on their policies and practices. Our field programs are the ones that are working with the farmers. So what we try and do, and we work in 28 countries around the world where we have teams on the ground that do a whole range of activities, working with local governments, working with communities, working with the farmers, in training, helping them implement the better farming practices, and supporting creation of protected areas. They do that whole range of conservation activities. What we're trying to do on our team is put that together. We know there's been tremendous progress in the private sector, and a lot of that from consumer pressure over the last 10, 15 years, in getting the big actors to think a lot more about sustainability, to try and source more sustainability, and that's what we're trying to push. I think one of the key messages I would have for this group, though, is that what we've heard, the common thread throughout all this, is that the food system that we all live in and depend upon is big, it's complex, it's got some real serious problems, and there's some very powerful economic drivers that make it work the way it does. And so this isn't going to be an overnight switch. This is going to be an evolution. Again, we've made good progress, but we need to continue to push on all of the levers we have to keep changing the system. And whether it's egg crates or more sustainable sourcing or certified product, we need to continue to push on the system. And again, you guys are relatively educated consumers, or you wouldn't be here, and you're interested in this topic. And so I would encourage all of you guys to continue. You probably look for certified products. You may even reach out to some of the big brands. I would encourage you to continue to ask the companies the questions. How are they sourcing their products? What's their plan of action for engaging suppliers? Do they have timelines for pushing continuous improvement? And a lot of what we see now is certification movement started with some of the niche brands and markets, and it's grown and it's evolved over time. And you have some of the big actors now who say, yeah, we're getting certified product, that's great. We know that's not great. It's good. It's movement in the right direction, but we need to continue to press beyond just saying, hey, I'm certified, I'm good, leave it alone. Because again, the food systems are complex, supply chains are complex. We need to be getting the companies to work more directly with suppliers, to be looking for efficiencies in the system, to figure out what are the incentives, what are the carrots that farmers need to really change practices. And that's going to require more direct engagement from the big actors in the food system. It's figuring out what is beyond certification and what are those models? And so again, encouraging those big actors to continue pushing that direction.
I'm going to ask you the question I asked Paul. How do you get those big corporations to embrace what you are selling them?
Well, I mean, the big ones and the leaders get it, that there's a number of factors at play, not the least of which is their brand reputation. And so that's a big driver for most, just about any of the big brands out there. But the sophisticated ones also recognize that there's more to it than that their supply, security of supply, costs in the supply chain, if there's volatility in your supply chain, in the commodities that you buy, that drives costs into your system. That's not good for your business. And to pick on the coffee sector, there are real challenges in the coffee sector. And if you have the best farming practices and you're protecting forests and you've got clean water, if there is no good schools or a health clinic in that community, and because of that farmers are migrating to cities to try and find a better life for their kids, that's a real problem for the coffee buyers. If you want a high quality premium coffee from a place like Oaxaca with an industry that's collapsed, it's been hit by disease and farmers are giving up, they know they need to get involved. The buyers know they need to get involved and start solving those problems. And so they see that risk and they see the challenges, and that's what motivates a lot of them.
You mentioned certification and seem to indicate that that's not the best that you can do is to have a certified program. Are you seeing certain certifications work though?
I think and don't get me wrong, I think certifications are important, and again, in long, complex supply chains with companies that are far down the value chains, that may be the only thing they can do right now. And so I'm very supportive of them. We should encourage the companies to support those. But I think what we're seeing is that, and what we know now from various studies, because you're certified X doesn't necessarily mean that deforestation is stopping. Because you're certified in Y, maybe fair trade, it doesn't mean that there isn't still poverty in your supply base, or that those farmers may still not have several months of the year when they're hungry. And so I think the challenge that we're wrestling with is how do we get beyond certification systems? How do we make it manageable enough for companies that are far down the value chain to be sourcing sustainably? What's that tool, that mechanism that they use? We do a lot of work in the palm oil sector. And so the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil is a great example. It's an initiative that's trying to drive sustainability throughout the entire palm oil sector. In just a few short years, I think it were about 6 years since our first certification took place, we've got 18% of global production certified under the RSPO standard. That isn't to say that that means all problems in palm oil have gone away, because they know they haven't. It isn't to say that we couldn't have higher standards in RSPO, but this is a huge step that's really fast growth in a commodity certification. Only half of that certified product globally is being purchased today. That sends a really bad signal to the production sector, to producers who came along on this journey reluctantly, who said, this sustainability stuff, just Europe, you're not serious. And when half of what they produce under a certified system isn't purchased, that just reinforces that signal. So that's a good example where the big companies can do more. They should be 100% certified today, and they should be supporting investments in how do we help that standard get stronger? How do we help address the problems at the ground? In a lot of cases, that means engaging directly with their suppliers, helping their suppliers work up their supply chain, and working with the local governments, because these market-based approaches alone have their limits.
If I could add something, these guys are so much more sophisticated than anybody else in attacking supply chain from the top end and using the companies. But when you look at what they're certifying, it's not about nourishment. Nourishment isn't there because that wasn't their mission. Their mission was sustainability and conservation, so they've got that certified. But the most malnourished people in the world grow cocoa. The sickest people in the world grow cocoa, and because they're malnourished, their kids are stunted, which means they can't learn, which means they don't have a future, and which means, by the way, talking about genetics, through epigenetics, we've learned that their kids are going to be that bad. So it's what I'll give a plea, which is at Ashoka, we worked really hard to try to understand how my colleague who runs our environmental stuff and I could work together. And we came up with a concept called the nutrient value chain, which is really kind of straightforward. It is at each step of this, nourish the thing, the stage, as much as you can. If it's a forest, nourish the forest. Soil, nourish the soil. Food, nourish the food. People, nourish the people. And then with the people, don't just stop at food, for God's sake, because if you've got diarrhea or malaria, you can't absorb the food. So But that's the process. Think politically, though. Who are your allies? Because your allies at each stage are the people who are being forced to pay the external costs. It's not the producers paying the external costs. So we're all trained to do the thing that we're trained to do. We're not trained. The enviros have gotten to a point where they could really use the health community. The health community doesn't know squat about nutrition, and they don't know much about environment. That's your problem. But actually, the health community should really care about nourishment because that's what's making people sick. And you can't get nourishing food unless you nourish the environment. So there's a lot we can all learn. And my great advantage in coming into this several years ago is I didn't know anything. So I just listened to experts. So there's a plea for political alliances, economic alliances, to make this change.
I think that's a great example of where, again, we need to kind of find different models, and we know that certification is important, but it may not go far enough. And so what do these new partnerships or alliances look like? How do we put them together? There's a lot of work, a lot of discussion in some circles around jurisdictional approaches or territorial approaches or integrated landscape approaches, and that is an effort to try and put these different sectors together, get the conservation community to work with the development community, to work with the health community, the ag sector, and I think that's what we need more of. Some of the companies get frustrated because what I just said is a fuzzy, confused, murky message. It's not as simple as go get certified, but that's where we need to be. We need to be investing in these models and these systems. I'll give a plug for the Landscapes for People, Food, and Nature initiative. I think there was somebody speaking from them yesterday where they're really trying to understand how can these integrated approaches work, who's doing them, what worked, what didn't work. Let's capture and catalog those models. So just to give a shout out to them.
We have a question from someone that was submitted online. Jody asks, first she says, the info on true costs, ecological, health, economic, are well understood within food policy circles. Jody, I would say that within certain populations that is true. I don't know if the whole country gets that. But she asks, what will it take to translate this information into a paradigm shift to apply this knowledge to policy? Who wants to take that?
Let me try health, because we're seeing a sea change in health. We're moving from a piecework-based system where I make money if you come to me and I do a test or I do an operation, to a system where the health system, whatever it is, gets paid to keep you well. That is causing a revolution in the industry so that the physical health people are saying, damn, I got to worry about mental health because that's part of that. So they're reaching out to mental health people for the very, very first time. And they're starting to see nutrition as something more than the person who runs the cafeteria. So the health industry has a reason to listen and to support the food policy changes you want to have. The educational system is starting to figure out that kids who are properly nourished behave better, learn better, and so on. So they have a reason. These are two new allies who can help you on policy.
Jenn,
yeah.
Can you answer this question? Because I think what David is talking about is the sort of the groups that are energized to kind of bring the issue. But getting the policymakers to actually move the issue, what has to happen?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I wish I had the answer, but I can take a stab at it. I mean, several people throughout the last day and a half have been trying to talk through this question. We need to build the power of the people who are advocating for these sorts of changes. I think currently, food and agriculture policy, I mean, it didn't even get a bare mention in the State of the Union address the other night. None at all. In fact, I got the transcript right before the speech started.
We stayed up really late at Politico to watch that speech.
And you got nothing, yeah. I mean, you know, you have the First Lady out there talking about how important the fight against childhood obesity is, and you know, the president saying I'm right there with her. But when it comes to the policy side of things, we aren't seeing much in the way of transformative vision or change. And I think that that's something we've really advocated for to change. I think we need to pressure our political leaders to make it a top priority. Right now, if you ask, do you care about, you know, healthier food and sustainable agriculture, you're going to get lots of head nods and yeah, that's fine. But when it comes to a vote on the Farm Bill or on the Child Nutrition Act or any of these other pieces of policy, you're not seeing any kind of radical transformative kind of vision out there. And, you know, you're not getting any policymakers willing to stick their neck out and take that position, because right now the public doesn't rank it very high on their priority list. So they won't take a risk and take a position on something that might get them whacked by some of the powerful, agribusiness moneyed interests if they're not going to get support from their voters in return. So I think that's where, groups like Food Policy Action and others have really started to make a case that elected officials need to be held accountable for their votes on food issues. And I think it's, the right time for citizens to make it known that they care very much about this issue and will be watching what votes take place or don't.
I see Patrick down in the audience. He's getting a mic. Good.
I would just like to have a go addressing your question, which is, I think, Jodie's question, which is so important. The German Rainbow Green Coalition, which I think was 2002, had an agriculture minister called Renate Künast, and just after they got into power, she and her Minister of State sat down and said, what can we do about energy change? How can we shift away from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy? And they worked out what's known in Europe as the feed-in tariffs, where they effectively took money from the fossil fuel energy providers and gave it to renewable energy producers. And we need to do for food what they did for renewable energy. And I think we need to be opportunistic, because every now and again, a political window will emerge where there is an opportunity to introduce such a policy. We need to be ready, having already formulated what the nitrogen tax would look like, and then we need to sell it to the politicians who are looking to stay in elected, and they might then be interested in it. So I think we need to do a lot of thinking about what the policy instruments are, and then wait, like the surfer, wait for the wave to come in and then act.
Can I just add one additional thought, which is that the paradigm shift is not just relating to food and agriculture policy, it's relating to how we are governed and what our government's purpose is. So I think, our government's purpose is to look out for the public interest. So public health, environmental, labor, all the other things that have to do with the well-being of our citizens. And yet, that's not always the foremost concern, and we don't see that leading as a vision for. And often, especially when it comes to food, it's not a sector like electronics, where your smartphone or whatever. It's not integral to your being the way that food is. So if what profit statements look like, for food companies, that means something very different. And so we can't just govern according to what is the most profitable thing for food companies. We need to govern according to what is best for our citizens' public health and for our environment and well-being.
The key to this panel, the title was proper accounting. And in the previous panel, somebody talked about tyranny of cheap food. And as somebody who spent a lot of time, lived my whole life since 15 in this town and watched policy debates go on, I think we ought to be really clear here what's happened, is that there's certain form of agriculture was heavily subsidized by the United States government and the Indian government and the.
Right.
And so everything from supply chain to seeds and all of that has been heavily subsidized. Right. That's okay. We asked them to produce more food cheaper. They did that. Now we know better. We need to change the signal and simply say, no, we're not subsidizing that anymore. As you said, we're subsidizing this. And that's because if we don't, we're going to incur enormous public costs. We're starting to incur them today. So don't talk to me about cheap food. Don't talk to me about what the public needs. The real cost of this is enormous. And it's, final comment, this isn't about food. If we just make it about food, we lose. If we just make it about health, we lose. If it's just about the environment, we lose. I think we win when we combine them all together.
It's a great way to wrap up the panel, because I see that we're out of time. So let's just close it out. I'd like to thank Food Tank again. This was a great experience. It was a great panel. Wonderful thoughts. I look forward to talking to you all again at some point in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to be a customer.